not a Democrat. And so I don't think that's our responsibility.
Stacey Abrams delivered the Democratic response last night. She didn't actually watch the president's speech. So what was the purpose of her message, do you think?
Well, I think she had two messages. I think it was very good for the party to have her there. Everybody knows that she ran a great race. A lot of people suspect that things were stacked against her. They think the Secretary of State played a role in defining the outcome of that election. And so I think that we were doing what we thought was necessary to hold her out as a part of the future of this party. She, I think, was auditioning for a Senate race.
Maybe, just in terms of 2020, very quickly, you are seen as something of a kingmaker or perhaps a queenmaker in South Carolina when it comes to the Democratic primary there. Any thoughts about whether or not you may support one candidate or another?
Oh, yeah, I think about it all the time.
What do you think?
I'm not going to do much about it.
Really?
No, I don't think so. I think it would be unfair for me to get involved. I have former staffers working in 3 or 4 different campaigns. I got family members who are split. I got 3 daughters, and I'm not sure they're all on the same page when it comes to that. So I'm going to stay out of it. I'm going to vote. And I might talk about that the day before I vote.
Okay, but not now. I think about it all the time. Boy, would we like to know how you think about it all the time right now, and I'm sure the candidates would as well. Congressman Jim Clyburn, South Carolina, thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
All right, much more on the State of the Union right now.
An economic miracle is taking place, and the only thing that can stop it, ridiculous partisan investigations.
He is bridling under the Democratic majority. We're not going to turn and look the other way.
The shutdown was a stunt engineered by the President of the United States.
Where walls go up, illegal crossings go way, way down.
I saw this as a psychotically incoherent speech. He tries to put together these warm, kind things about humanitarianism. At the same time, he is demonizing people.
You saw the president that landed his speech in one of the most historic speeches I can remember.
I will get it built.
There was a lot of signals to the base. And the question is, what is his definition of compromise?
This is New Day with Allison Camerata and John Berman.
Good morning and welcome to your new day. It is Wednesday, February 6th, 8 o'clock here in Washington, D.C., the morning after the State of the Union address. Allison is off. Poppy Harlow is here with me. Hey,
Good morning.
And a whole new table all of a sudden majestically appears here around us.
Exactly.
All right, President Trump. He started and ended his State of the Union address with a message of unity, but in between, lots of times when he struck a different tone. Of course, this was his first address in a divided Congress with Nancy Pelosi, the new House Speaker, literally staring over his shoulder.
An economic miracle is taking place in the United States, and the only thing that can stop it are foolish wars, politics, or ridiculous partisan investigations. If there is going to be peace and legislation, there cannot be war and investigation. It just doesn't work that way.
The loaded slow move into Adam Schiff.
Yeah.
President Trump renewed his call for a border wall, but did not issue any new threats as congressional negotiators meet about border security, trying to avert another government shutdown.
In the Democratic response, Stacey Abrams denounced the president's policies on key issues, of course, immigration, gun safety, health care, but caught the attention of many with this closing statement.
So, even as I am very disappointed by the president's approach to our problems, I still don't want him to fail. But we need him to tell the truth and to respect his duties and respect the extraordinary diversity that defines America.
Joining us now, former Ohio Governor John Kasich, former senior advisor to former President Obama, David Axelrod, CNN senior political reporter Nia Malika Henderson, and our CNN political analyst David Gregory. Good morning, one and all. And Governor, to you first. Welcome to CNN. This is your first time being on with me. We're glad to have you here.
Thank you.
I was watching you last night, and you talked about this ahead of the address as a test for the president. A test for the president. Can he bend? Can he reach out? What did you see?
Well, look, I think he touched his base, which he needed to do with a number of things that he said, including the wall, abortions, the economy, cutting regulations. But then I think he tried to reach out, and look, he scored a pretty good score from the American people last night. But you know what's interesting? Even though the numbers were pretty good for the speech, it doesn't seem like anybody became more optimistic about the future here. They're not saying, oh, well, I think this is going to be a pattern. They're going to be able to work together. I'm not hearing that. And you know why? It's been a raucous, understatement, a raucous 2 years. And so, you know, one speech doesn't change all that. So his actions are going to have to belie his words. And, you know, the most interesting test is going to be how they resolve immigration.
The governor was talking about the Insta poll after the speech here on CNN. 59% said they approved of the president's message, which was the highest he has received for one of these addresses to a joint session. What was so notable about that was this was the most partisan audience he has ever had for a speech like this. 2-1 Republican. And it gets to the question Maggie Haberman asked this last hour. Is there anyone whose mind can even be changed at this point? And David Axelrod, I think the most interesting framing of this address last night, and perhaps the Democratic response, is as a curtain raiser to 2020.
Without question. And I think that's how one should view the speech. You know, we often underestimate Donald Trump, and it was easy to do that with that speech last night, which I believe was poorly written and leadenly delivered. But within all of that were the outlines of an argument for re-election, and it's what you're going to hear, you know, the economy, tough on trade, tough on immigration, getting America out of these wars, forcing the Europeans to pay their debt, and a portrayal of the Democrats, you know, once you set aside all of the embroidery about bipartisanship as, you know, socialists, as radical on abortion, as for open borders, that is the outline of the campaign that Donald Trump is going to run in 2020.
How do you think, Nia, Democrats responded? And I don't just mean Stacey Abrams. We'll get to that in a moment. I mean responses without words, moments of sitting on hands, moments of not applauding. How would you rate Democrats?
I mean, there were moments of that. And in some ways, you could see Nancy Pelosi back there being the conductor of those folks who were sitting there, particularly all of the women in white. At some point, they kind of wanted to boo the president. She didn't want that to happen because she said before that, you know, she thinks that the president should be treated with respect. The office should be respected, even if he doesn't respect the office, in her words. She said that. I think the Stacey Abrams response, she's in a red state, right? And so you could see her in some ways trying to come off as a moderate. Republicans have obviously tried to paint her as an extremist on any number of issues, guns, for instance, and immigration. But I think she struck a really nice tone, particularly in trying to reach out to working class folks, white working class voters. This is a segment of the population that Democrats didn't do well with in 2016. And so yeah, I mean, I think they're trying to obviously set up a contrast, not only in terms of policy and values, but even in terms of who represents the party, right? Before they had white men doing the response to the State of the Union, at least some Democrats feel like the energy is in people like Stacey Abrams.
Well, I think what's really important about what you're saying is this question of who speaks for us as Americans. You know, one of the reasons I believe that President Obama was elected is that Americans got uncomfortable with the notion of President Bush at that time speaking for Americans on the world stage. I think there was discomfort with that. So I think the contrast is really important. But I do agree with Axe in this regard. I mean, the president's got a strong economy. Thankfully, the country is at peace. He's at his best when he's uniting Republicans, whether it's about hardline views on abortion or speaking out against socialism. He's very effective, and he's been effective at uniting Republicans. And, you know, the specter of the Mueller investigation this year, I think we always have to allow for the possibility that that line, the idea of a ridiculous investigation, will be vindicated in a lot of people's minds, depending on what the outcome is. He could be strengthened by all of this, not necessarily weakened by it. And I think a lot of people were watching that speech last night who don't hear him in that level of depth on a big stage like that, where he's not engaging in erratic behavior and you know, tweet storming and all the rest. And I think so for people who are not parsing this the way we are, there was a lot there that
I think
they
you're
could
right.
take
I got text messages from friends, family family in Minnesota saying that, saying, oh, it's not a great look for the Democrats. You know, the president sounds pretty measured here, and some of them are sitting on their hands. Or
when the socialism thing came
because
up, right?
they don't do this every day. It's an interesting
well,
point.
what's interesting is when he reads from a teleprompter, it's the one time that his staff can discipline him,
right.
is when he has to stand in public and read off of a teleprompter. But even last night, when he ad-libbed, he got into some deep water. He said, for example, at one point that he was for, more legal immigration than ever, when his policy is actually to cut legal immigration in half. So I'm sure that gave some heartburn to his staff. But, the question is how much of the sort of what I called embroidery, the appeals to bipartisanship and so on, appeal to people. And I think that there's some heavy skepticism about that, just as there probably was some skepticism when Stacey Abrams said, I don't want him to fail. I'm not sure how many people believe that. That we should feel that way, but I don't know how many Democrats actually feel that way at this point.
Mm-hmm. Two years ago, I remember when the president made a State of the Union, I was with some friends, and when he delivered it 2 years ago, people had a sigh of relief. Oh, my goodness, he's not calling names. He stood up. He was acting like a president. Last year, it didn't go over as well. I don't know why that is. This year, he tried to stick to the script, and I think people in this country want politicians to work together and solve problems. They do. And the question is, where does this go? I mean, just one speech, one day, one night. Now what? What happens now? I don't know if he had any tweets this morning or anything, but if he's going to go back to attacking people again, then he's going to double down on the base.
Two days ago, to your point, 2 days ago, he accused Pelosi of being responsible for deaths all over the country because of her position on immigration. He is not by nature, he's not about multiplication, he's about division. And division is what had delivered the presidency to him. I don't think he's going to change, Governor.
I'm sorry. I mean, the State of the Union doesn't matter. I mean, it doesn't matter anymore. And he's not going off selling the State of the Union messages. He's going to go back to doing what he does, and where there can be cooperation that's mutually beneficial, they'll do it. But let's not forget, the president, just like after the midterms, got up and said, I'll work with you unless you continue with these investigations, in which case I won't. So that's really what he believes.
But I do think we should look for places that there might be some progress. Is there some sort of policy place, whether it's paid family leave, is it infrastructure reform, like with criminal justice reform? This is something he touts. Drug prices. This is something he touts all the time as a big bipartisan
accomplishment. He should test Democrats on these issues. That would be a smart political move for him.
Well, they should test him on it as well.
Yes, absolutely.
We had Chuck Schumer on last hour, and he said infrastructure week, he said drug pricing.
Right.
Will you do something? And the Senate Minority Leader didn't have a policy there. He said, well, if the president's serious, he should come to us. And so they're just staring at each other now.
I'll tell you one thing, though. On infrastructure, it's very easy. Just pass out public dollars, okay? And we have a $21 trillion debt. And there are increasing numbers of Americans who are becoming concerned about the debt. I'm telling you, David, I've seen it reflected in some polls lately. And just to pass this bill, that's the easy one. Yeah. The hard, I don't know what they'll do and what the outcry will be over the debt, but the hard one would be the drug pricing. And if, in fact, they can bring transparency, they can begin to do some things to moderate drug prices, that's really hard on everybody's part.
I think paid family leave is maybe where there can be some bipartisanship. You think about Ivanka Trump as the face of that. You think about Kushner being the face of criminal justice reform. She sort of may want to win in the way that Kushner was able to push through a criminal justice reform with a lot of allies, obviously. So we'll see. It is all about how you pay for it.
I was just going to say it's about how you pay for it.
If the predicate is no investigations, there's not going to be any bipartisanship.
Yeah. Can I just say one of the things that struck me, and again, some of this is looking backwards, not forwards, given the way the president leaned on the economy last night, and given how I do think this was a curtain raiser on 2020, his message there, it provided a window for me into why he was so unsettled in December when the stock market was falling like it was, and the Fed
And who did he have dinner with this week?
He had dinner with the Fed chairman, because if he does not have the economy, if he doesn't have that to lean on, he's in serious trouble.
Serious trouble. And it's why a strong economy is really hard for Democrats to unseat him when you have an incumbent who's got a good economy. And he got spooked in this government shutdown by that LaGuardia thing when the planes weren't flying and when his guy came out, Kevin Hassett came out and said, we've got zero economic growth.
To me, he didn't want to admit it, but when I pressed Hassett on that, he said, yes, we could get there.
Right.
And it was a few days later that we saw you know, the president concede here. You go ahead.
One caveat on this economic issue is that we do have uneven prosperity, uneven growth, and regionally uneven. So there are places in the country that haven't shared in this to the degree that others have. And so you have to be a little bit measured about how you claim progress. And he's not good at that.
I think to that point, I mean, March 1st is going to tell us a lot, because the impact of not reaching a trade deal with China could be enormous when it comes to the fallout for middle America in terms of manufacturing jobs, in terms of prices going up from a tariff of 10% to 25%. Look at the Ohio GM.
They were probably hurt by the unemployment
First of all, they will end up with something. I don't think it'll be the major trade deal, the structural changes he talks about, but I think they'll figure something there. You know what I want to keep my eyes on are these independents. Where did the independents go here? If you take a look at the election, the midterm election we just had, a lot of women, young people, independents moved against the Republicans. The question is, has he softened them up at all? He hasn't with one speech, but what does he do over time? Because if he loses all of them and he's stuck with this narrow base, then it's a campaign he has to run where he's tearing somebody else down, and that is not going to be good for the country.
And I think that's where some of his policies that he talked about last night come in. The HIV, childhood cancer, even the paid family leave. Those are the kind of, I think, policies that can get independents interested in him, certainly attract women as well. So I think we should watch for all those policies and see what he does with them.
All right, thank you very, very much. A great discussion.
A great discussion. President Trump defended his decision to withdraw troops from Syria last night. You heard that. Something a top general says that the commander of CENTCOM, he was not even told about. We'll talk to the senator who pressed him on that question just yesterday.
It is time to give our brave warriors in Syria a warm welcome home. I have also accelerated our negotiations to reach, if possible, a political settlement in Afghanistan.
The president last night in the State of the Union defending his decision to withdraw U.S. troops from Syria and Afghanistan. With me this morning, independent Senator Angus King of Maine. He serves on the Intelligence and the Armed Services Committee, caucuses with the Democrats. It's nice to have you, and let's begin on that.
Sure.
On Syria, from the president, he chose not to repeat his false claim that ISIS had been defeated in Syria, but he did say, look, our soldiers deserve to come home. Essentially, this has gone on long enough. Does it encourage you that he didn't repeat that false statement, that he's listening to his generals? Or are you concerned at the overarching message?
Well, he didn't repeat it, which was a good thing. On the other hand, the problem is, as we heard testimony just yesterday in the Armed Services Committee, there are between 20 and 30,000 members of ISIS, about 15,000 in Syria and Iraq. So clearly there's still a threat there. But what really worried me, there were two things that worried me about his decision on Syria. One was the process. As we learned yesterday in the Armed Services Committee, he didn't even consult the general on the ground.
So for anyone who missed that, let's play that for him. This is the exchange between you and General Vodal, who leads CENTCOM. Right. Let's roll it.
General, were you aware of the president's intention to order the withdrawal of our troops from Syria before that was publicly announced?
I was not aware of the specific that announcement. Certainly, we are aware that he has expressed a desire and intent in the past to depart Iraq.
So you weren't consulted before that decision was announced.
We were not. I was not consulted.
Okay, two questions on that. First, yes, it's shocking. Does it concern you that, given his statement, it is clear that the president is conducting foreign policy through a political prism there and not through the advice or counsel of his top generals?
There's an old saying that a good process doesn't guarantee good results, but a bad process almost guarantees bad results. And this was no process, apparently. The president, as near as we can tell, didn't consult anyone in the national security apparatus. It came as a surprise to everyone. The second problem, Poppy, is the Kurds. They've been literally taking bullets for us for 5 years. They've been our most steadfast ally. The Turks can't wait to go after them. Okay. And if we abandon the Turks and let them be run over by, abandon the Kurds and let them run over by the Turks, it will be, number one, a stain on this country's honor. But secondly, who's going to help us next time?
Well, and that is the reason abandoning the Kurds was the final straw for General Mattis resigning. The second question to what we just heard from the general there is, so now what? After you heard that, where does it leave us? Yes, there's a Senate resolution that passed yesterday that you voted for, proposed by Mitch McConnell.
Of all people.
Of all people, to keep troops there. But now what?
Well, you could tell from the other questions of the general that the military is doing what they do, which is follow orders and do the best they can. And they're working out a plan for withdrawal and trying to do it in a more thoughtful way. But they're sort of backfilling on a pronouncement that had no policy undergirding at the time. And by the way, everybody wants to bring our troops home. The question is, how do we do it? And do we do it in such a way that doesn't get us in a worse condition? For example, ISIS comes back. ISIS reconstitutes, and we have to go back in. And, you know, it was just a precipitous decision that didn't have the support of anybody.
What we did hear the president do is out loud condemn Russia, condemn the actions of Russia by saying Russia violated the INF, and therefore we're pulling out. Significant to you? Important?
Well, it was significant that he made that statement very clearly, that he justified pulling out of the INF because of that. There was a disturbing little one sentence there that really bothered me, though. He said something about, to the effect, if other people are building missiles and bombs, we're going to outspend them and build more.
You mean an arms race?
It sounded, in my notes, I said arms race.
Let's talk about 2020. Yes, you're an independent, but as I mentioned, you caucus with the Democrats. It's a crowded field already.
Crowded.
And we know that Minnesota Senator Amy Klobuchar is going to make a decision this Sunday on 2020. Some see her as more centrist than a lot of those who've jumped in so far. Which direction do you believe the Democratic Party needs to go in if it wants to defeat President Trump? Is it the far left?
You're
I'm asking the independent. I'm aware of that.
Come on, that's their business. Come on. I'll, you know.
How to attract, I mean, look, independents, Howard Schultz may run as a centrist independent.
Well, it's you know, that's about 40% of the country. About the parties are roughly 30-30, and then a majority are unenrolled, but particularly young people. There's
a reason, right, that an independent has never won. Ross Perot came closest, a little over 19%. And those are the numbers Howard Schultz points to, the 40% of independents.
Right.
But do you believe that those who identify as independent will actually abandon their party when push comes to shove and vote for an independent?
Well,
are you glad to see if Howard Schultz gets in the race?
Well, I don't want to comment on that. I think it's too early. But the question, it's funny, the independents aren't a party. By definition, they're people, they're leaning right, leaning left. They align sometimes with some parties and sometimes with others. There's a really interesting fact about the 2016 election. 63 million people voted for Hillary Clinton. About 60 million voted for Donald Trump. 100 million didn't vote. That's an amazing number. And if you think about it... It's a sad
statement about the country.
Well, it's a statement about our civic engagement, but it's also a statement about there are a lot of votes there to be gotten if somebody can reach out to that group.
Why don't you want to comment on Howard Schultz if he runs as a centrist independent? You say it's too early. Look at all these Democrats who've already jumped in. We'll pull them up on the screen, many of them to the far left, which is why he has left the Democratic Party and said, I can't run in this party.
Well, I think having more voices in the campaign and somebody in the center is probably a good thing. The mechanics of it are very difficult. The way our electoral system works is, except for Maine and Nebraska, every state is winner take all. If you get one more vote in Pennsylvania, you get all the Pennsylvania electoral votes. The question is, what would the role of an independent be in that election? Now, Perot, interestingly, the polls afterwards said Perot drew, the conventional wisdom is he beat George Bush. 36% would have voted for Bush, 36% would have voted for Clinton, and 24% wouldn't have voted. So the idea that an independent will necessarily draw from one or the other of the parties, I don't think is really
and when
valid.
you dig into that polling and you take him out, Perot out, it was 42-43 Bush to Clinton, so it was pretty even there. It's interesting. We'll watch. We appreciate you being here this morning.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much,
Yes,
Senator
indeed.
Angus King. John.
All right, Senator Elizabeth Warren, dogged again by new revelations about her heritage just days before formally jumping in the 2020 race. Why is she apologizing again? Next. All right, Senator Elizabeth Warren from Massachusetts is apologizing again after new revelations about her heritage, or claims she has made about her heritage. The Washington Post obtained Warren's Texas State Bar registration form from 1986, where she wrote that her race was, I think the word she used, were American Indian there. Joining us now, MJ Lee, CNN national political correspondent, and David Chalian, CNN political director. MJ, first to you, because you've done some reporting on this new information that came out just within the last 24 hours. Tell us exactly what's going on here.
Well, what's going on is that the Washington Post has reported on a new example that we didn't know about previously of a time when Elizabeth Warren wrote that her racial identity, that her racial background was Indian American. And, you know, this is an example. And here's actually the visual of that. You can see this is from when she was actually at the University of Texas back in the 1980s. And I should say American Indian. If I said Indian American, I meant to say American Indian. This is so significant because in the past, we weren't really sure, and she hasn't really given a clear answer, and I think the Washington Post did a good job of laying this out, of whether the senator herself was involved in the various forms that she has filled out in identifying her as such. But this makes it clear that this is in her own writing, and her team is not disputing the authenticity of this form. They are also not disputing that this is her own handwriting. I think, John, it is very clear that her team has not figured out how to handle this. And I think a lot of that just simply has to do with the fact that this is genuinely a very, very sensitive issue where they've had to tread very lightly. But I think at every turn of this, there's not been really a perfect solution or a way for them to sort of get out of this political mess for them, whether it was, you know, people calling on her to take the DNA test, whether it was people really viewing the video and the release of that test as a flop, and then the whole apology last week. Again, I think that this is not an issue that is going away for her because it is a difficult issue for her to handle, and there's not a clear answer on how to deal with this.
Yeah, I think there are two things going on here, David. Number one, there's, of course, the process question, which how she is handling this. But this story and those words, American Indian, which she clearly signed herself, also get to the substance of it.
No doubt about it. I mean, I think it said race, right? And she wrote in American Indian. Here's the problem. This has now been 6 years. This is 6 years that she has been battling this charge against her. And so, as you know, in the fall, she took that DNA test, but then she had to apologize to Cherokee Nation. She just did so again a few days ago. She says that she's sorry that she's not making clear enough the difference between her ancestry and membership to a tribal nation. She understands that's totally different. But if you are just a couple days before your formal launch of your presidential campaign, and you are still apologizing for something you've been answering about for 6 years, I think it's fair to say that you have not positioned yourself in a way to put this behind you as you begin to launch your presidential campaign.
Not behind it all.
Yeah.
I mean, it's front and center, it seems, just constantly here.
No lesson learned from Hillary Clinton and the email debacle and when you're explaining you're losing?
Well, you know, the way that Elizabeth Warren and her team around her has said, and MJ just alluded to this, so many people were hammering her political opponents, as well as some allies, take a DNA test, so she took it. And that didn't solve this. That didn't put the topic away. And I don't think anybody really thought it would, but it was a box she checked that she thought she'd be able to point to and then continue to move on. But the biggest question here is, how many other forms are out there where she may have filled this out? Is this Texas registration form the last of this? Or does the campaign know if anything else is out there and anticipating something else?
And MJ, as you look at this and you look at the size of the Democratic field, the challenge for Elizabeth Warren will be there are a lot of other choices out there. If you're a Democratic voter and you like the message that Elizabeth Warren is delivering, well, maybe you can find that in a package which doesn't have as many question marks or you know, doesn't have this explaining or apologizing.
That's right. And one thing I would note about this Texas bar registration is that one note that they're making, the Warren team is making, is that this was not anything to do with the application to the bar. This was a form that she filled out after she was already admitted to the bar. Obviously an important distinction. However, I don't know know if this is a distinction that is going to actually sink in for the average person that is sort of tuning in and out of the headlines of 2020, right? And I think the point is that for the people who might already be inclined to sort of question her motives here, for the people who might already be sort of seeing this as an example of Elizabeth Warren having been dishonest or, you know, having used this to try to further her career in a way that doesn't sit well with them, this example, regardless of, you know, sort of the details of the form and regardless of the fact that her team says this had nothing to do with her entrance to the bar, I think this is just going to cement certain people who are already inclined to view her negatively.
Very quickly, David, because we're out of time here. Beto sort of very much opening the door yesterday. Beto O'Rourke to Iran, and Amy Klobuchar saying she's going to announce something on Sunday.
Right, in her home state of Minnesota.
Yeah.
So I don't know that there's too much mystery there. But yes, when Beto O'Rourke got on stage with Oprah Winfrey yesterday, we got a timeline from him. We're going to get an announcement from him at the end of the month. He said it's a role he wants to play. Yeah. So it sounded like he's very much actively in the final stages of coming to a decision about potentially running.
This is going to get interestinger and interestinger, as they say in Alice in Wonderland. David Chalian, MJ Lee, thank you very much.
We have a new word for the morning. Interesting.
Thank you, Lewis Carroll.
All right. President Trump suggested that he would welcome many legal immigrants during his State of the Union address. In fact, more than ever before, he says his policies just show that's not what he really thinks or what he supports. They paint a very different picture. A reality check is next. All right, President Trump says he wants more immigrants entering the United States as long as they come here legally. That's what he said in the State of the Union last night. So does that mean that the Trump administration has been good for the rights of legal immigrants? John Avlon with a very important reality check. What he said last night was so dramatically different, a departure from the policy of his own administration.
So let's dig into that, Polly. Look, one important part of the president's speech last night wasn't actually supposed to be part of the speech. Listen.
I want people to come into our country in the largest numbers ever, but they have to come in legally.
So that middle part, largest numbers ever, was an ad lib, and it's one place where the president probably shouldn't have stuck to the script. Now, we all know the Trump administration is obsessed with illegal immigration, but behind the scenes, it's also in a quiet war with legal immigration. Trump has blasted what he calls chain migration, whereby family members follow each other legally into the country, despite the fact that the First Lady's family is here on that plan. Now, Trump's made it harder to get certain visas, even simple visitor visas, which dropped off more than 10% under Trump, according to Politico. He's curtailed visas for same-sex partners of foreign diplomats. He's dramatically reduced the number of refugees legally seeking asylum in our country, and is even trying to deport some Vietnamese war refugees who've been here for decades. So what's behind all this? Well, in former Trump staffer Cliff Sims' new book, Team of Vipers, he quotes senior aide Stephen Miller as saying, quote, "I would be happy if not a single refugee foot ever again touched American soil." So when the president says he wants more people to come into our country in the largest numbers ever, don't believe the hype. And then there's this little irony. While the president was blasting socialism, he denounced, quote, government coercion, domination, and control. So it's worth noting that the president plans to use eminent domain to take land from private citizens to build parts of his border wall. Last time I checked, nothing says socialism quite like seizing private property for a government goal. And that's your reality check.
The words he says, the words he means to say, and then what those words actually mean. All right, John Avlon, appreciate it. Thank you very much. Pope Francis acknowledging for the first time that priests and bishops have sexually abused nuns in the Roman Catholic Church. Nuns have been making abuse accusations in recent years in Italy, Latin America, India, and Africa. The Pope calls it a continuing problem and says even though the Vatican is working on the issue, more needs to be done.
All right, embattled Virginia Governor Ralph Northam's former medical school classmates are coming to his defense this morning. A group of them say they fully believe that Northam is not one of the individuals in this racist photo on his yearbook page. They add they don't believe the governor ever condoned racism. CNN interviewed a yearbook staffer who says photos on personal pages were chosen by the individual student. Meantime, the woman accusing Virginia's lieutenant governor of sexual assault 15 years ago is meeting with lawyers in Washington to figure out her next step. A source tells CNN that Vanessa Tyson felt she had to take action when she saw the news about Northam's yearbook photo and worried Fairfax could become governor of Virginia. Fairfax calls the allegation, quote, totally fabricated.
Now here is what to watch today.
to be nobody but yourself in a world which is doing its best to make you everybody else means to fight the hardest battle which any human being can fight and never stop. Does this sound dismal? It isn't. It's the most wonderful life on earth.
All right, ahead, one of the special guests of President Trump last night singled out during the State of the Union. That man, freed from prison after 2 decades. He is with us to share his story.
In 1996.
There were moments of unity last night, and a big one was on the bipartisan criminal justice reform that was passed. The president talked about that in the State of the Union, and he singled out a man from Nashville who was recently released from prison after more than 2 decades behind bars for drug offenses. Watch this.
In 1996, at the age of 30, Matthew was sentenced to 35 years for selling drugs and related offenses. Over the next 2 decades, he completed more than 30 Bible studies, became a law clerk, and mentored many of his fellow inmates. Now Matthew is the very first person to be released from prison under the First Step Act.
Wow, what a moment. Matthew Charles is with me now. Such a pleasure to have you.
Okay, thank you for having me here.
January 3rd, when you walked out of prison, was really the beginning of the rest of your life.
Oh, yes, it was.
And then you end up at the State of the Union last night. What was that moment for you like, Matthew, when the president said, and I know it struck me watching, welcome home?
Oh, it was amazing. I mean, it was like almost as equivalent to being released from prison.
Really?
Because the welcome home, to hear that society was on board with giving me a second chance was just amazing to hear.
Do you feel welcomed?
I do feel welcome, much so.
A lot of people don't know their first introduction to you was last night. But you actually went to the White House last week, before the State of the Union.
That's correct.
To meet with some members of Congress.
That's correct.
Tell me about that.
Last week, we were invited to meet some of the sponsors of the First Step Act, and we went over to the Senate as well as to the Congress and met some supporters and sponsors of the bill. And then we were invited to the White House to meet Jared Kushner, who was also very supportive and instrumental in getting that bill passed.
What did he say to you?
He just was telling me that he was thanking me for you being able to utilize my story to present that the bill should be passed to give these guys, our inmates, a second chance. So I was very pleased to hear that he had used my situation.
You have a daughter, 33-year-old daughter. You have 2 grandchildren.
Yes, sir.
One of them a 3-year-old little girl.
3-year-old boy.
3-year-old boy.
And a 13-year-old.
And a 13-year-old girl.
Okay.
Can't get that wrong. What do you want to do with the rest of your life?
Well, my heart's passion is to help the poor and the homeless and single-parent families. God instilled that in me along with my transformation in 1996. So that is one of my primary focuses. But the ability to be able to have a platform to speak about criminal justice reform, since I was incarcerated for 22 years, I want to take advantage of that situation and speak on behalf of those that have also changed, that don't have anybody speaking on their behalf.
Tell me about the work you're doing on that front, because you wrote an opinion piece in the Washington Post. The headline, I was released under the First Step Act. Here's what Congress should do next. And I know your push is for FAM, or Families Against Mandatory Minimums.
Yes, Families Against Mandatory Minimums was an organization that I had heard of when I first entered in the federal prison in 1996. And Ms. Mary Price was the founder of it, but I wasn't really familiar with the organization as far as personal. But once they heard about my situation and reached out to me to help me in this capacity, and now that I actually see that they're still trying to get the laws changed so that the punishment will be equivalent to the crime instead of over-punishment, I want to continue to speak and use that organization as well.
So what do you think, what do you hope would be the next step? This is intentionally called the First Step Act.
That's correct.
So if you had your druthers, what would the second step Step Act be?
Okay, the Second Step Act would be something along the lines where there are many that are still incarcerated with extensive sentences that the First Step Act will not apply to. So I would say the second step should be to see if they can actually come up with something, which I have an ideal to be able, present to them.
Which is what? What's your idea?
That if a person has served over 15 years on a sentence that extends or goes beyond that 15-year period, that the court be allowed to reassess that person based on his rehabilitation since he's been incarcerated, as well as his conduct.
And do you mean, you were, for example, in on drug charges, which overwhelmingly affects African Americans in this country. Do you also mean for violent offenders?
No, just nonviolent offenders.
Okay.
I would say those that have received extensive sentences for nonviolent crimes.
Because you write in your piece, I got lucky. Our justice system should not depend on luck. And previously, I believe you served in the military.
That's correct.
Is that correct? Before,
yes.
Before you were incarcerated. So, what is the single most important thing that could change so that it's not about luck? That you won't be the rarity. What would have to change?
That, say for instance, whenever a person is sentenced, the judge has the right to say, okay, I'm going to give you this sentence because the federal sentencing guidelines require it, or as mandatory minimum requires it, but I'm going to have your case reviewed or your sentence reviewed in 15 years to see if you've been rehabilitated in any capacity.
Let me ask you one final question very quickly. Yes, you're out.
Okay.
And yes, you get to start a new life, right?
Yes, ma'am.
But issue for many inmates is jobs.
Okay.
How has that been for you, getting employment, really integrating back into society?
Okay. When I first was released back in 2016, I went through an organization called Project Return. But there are not a lot of those organizations because Nashville has a population that exceeds 500,000 that was in place. But in the small areas or the cities and towns that don't really have the financial ability to do that, something needs to be put in place for those as well because people are being released from federal and state prison going to any state and city in America.
Right.
So I was fortunate enough to be able to go through that program, which helped you get job skills and find a job. But a lot of people won't have that benefit.
Right.
So there are job opportunities in Nashville. That's the reason I elected to go to Nashville.
And that keeps recidivism down. If
That's
you
correct.
have a job and you have a goal every day.
Yes, ma'am.
Matthew Charles, thank you.
Thank you for
very
having
much. It's really, really nice to meet you. We appreciate it.
Great to hear from people whose lives have been changed by
Remarkable.
bipartisanship.
Yes. There you go.
All right, we are expecting to hear from Democrats, senior Democrats leadership very shortly, their reaction to the president's speech and what they intend to do going forward. New developments ahead. Stick around.